So we're going to move on to our next speaker in our next presentation. We have Tom Kilcer here with us from Advanced Ag Systems. Tom worked for, I believe it was Cornell Cooperative Extension for a number of years before kind of heading off on his own and doing some consulting work and kickstarting the Advanced Ag Systems company. And he is here today to talk to us about using sorghum as a energy replacement for corn silage.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to be talking about a little bit different topic right now, being sorghum and Sorghum Sedan, and specifically an advance that we have found in sorghums of using a male sterile system, which, to most people doesn't make sense. Why are we going that route? Wouldn't it be more energy going differently? Well, we're going to be talking about that as we move into it. The main thing is successful livestock. Hang on, I got to drop something out of here. Drop this out, drop this out. Successful livestock production is growing energy, protein, digestible fiber, sufficient amounts, and low enough cost. It is not just corn and alfalfa. A lot of people think of that, but as far as the rumen bugs in the animal are concerned, they are looking for something a little bit different. One of the things that we see right away with using sorghum versus corn, especially as you move further south, is sorghum will grow up to 105 degrees while corn shuts down above 85. I took Roanoke data, Roanoke, Virginia data 2 years ago and tracked the days that were above 85 when corn was not growing. And 69% of the days during the season, it was too hot for corn to grow, but sorghum would keep on growing. The other piece, and a lot of people already know this, is that when you look at how much dry matter is produced per an inch of water compared to corn, sorghum is 2 to 3 times higher in the amount of dry matter it can produce when it turns dry. It'll still produce when it is wet, but it'll produce even more under drier conditions. So it gives you more consistent yield. Another big part, and for probably a lot of Delaware, it's flat, but as soon as you move out of that area into more rolling ground, soil erosion is a critical factor. And if you look on the picture on the left here, the bare ground of corn a month later, if that has any slope onto it, the soil is washing. And if it's not washing, it's being pounded, broken up, and then sealing over so air and water cannot move in, and all of this affects the growth of the crop that's on it. Whereas in the picture on the right, you look at sorghum or Sorghum Sedan, the ground is covered in 1 month. It intercepts raindrop impact. It also intercepts all of the sunlight, so you're maximizing the yield coming off of that ground. There is a concern, and matter of fact, 5 minutes ago, I had a phone call from somebody up in the north concerned about looking at sorghum versus corn. And he says, well, we have to take a yield hit if we grow sorghum. No, this is a variety trial, and I just picked off these varieties, nothing special. Off of the sorghum varieties trials we do for multiple companies. And right next to it was a corn variety trial. And both the mean of the corn silage and the max of the corn silage was not as high as what we had with just these varieties of forage sorghum. And this is grown an hour south of Montreal, Canada, 20 minutes inside the New York border from Canada. So this is far north. We are still getting good yields. The problem, though, excuse me, is right here. We put 2 or 3 pounds of grain on top of an 11-foot tall stalk that has a thickness of a fishing pole, and the whole thing bends over and collapses down, which makes it tough to harvest. It's a real mess at this point. And dealing with this early on in my researching career, we backed off of sorghum simply because of this. Yet they came out with a new genetic line, which is Butyric Dwarf. Butyric Dwarf is different than a regular dwarf. Grain sorghum is a dwarf crop. There are less nodes, so it's a shorter plant. Butyric Dwarf has the same number of nodes, but the distance between those nodes is shorter. Now you're saying, I don't want to grow a shorter crop, it'll give me yet less yield. Not so. If you look, a 7-foot tall basketball player versus a 6-foot tall football linebacker, the linebacker will outweigh the basketball player. And the same thing happens with the Butyric Dwarf. We are getting the yield on a shorter stalk. One of the advantages of sorghum is it has a wide range of options in the genetics, so we can select for what we need best on the farm that you are growing, the animals you are feeding. One of the pieces we looked at early on is a photoperiod sensitive. It does not head. So we don't have to worry about heading out, and you'll see why heading out is an issue, besides it all falling down, as I showed you 2 pictures before. Photoperiod sensitive doesn't dry down. It stays at about 15 to 17% dry matter, so you're hauling tons of water, and it doesn't concentrate the digestible components. It just simply puts on more yield. So you have a low digestible component with a whole lot of yield and a whole lot of water. It didn't sound like a success for us, so we have moved away and don't suggest photoperiod sensitive for that reason. Butyric Dwarf, I talked about, it has a disadvantage of being slow to emerge. So you make sure that you use a concept or a treated seed so you can use atrazine and dual to control the weeds. Otherwise, the weeds will eat you alive. Dry stalk is another gene that allows for a higher dry matter in the plant itself. So we are hauling more dry material, more forage, less water. And then finally is the male sterile. Male sterile is very similar to a beef steer. It does not produce viable pollen, and so does not have any seed set. These last 3 pieces is where I'm going to be focusing, and that's where most of our work is being focused on genetics, developing varieties to bring these components out for the farmers. Growing and harvesting sorghum or Sorghum Sedan. The key piece is when we first started out with this, we were thinking, well, we want to grow a winter forage because winter forages are incredibly profitable, produce very high quality feed. But to take them off, we then have to harvest our haylage, and then we come back and we're putting our corn in late. But if instead of growing corn, we grew sorghum, the sorghum does very well with the warmer temperatures. It really matched up with the winter forage. The problem we quickly ran into is this is normal Sorghum Sedan, planted into basically worked ground. There was no winter forage there. Right next to it, we had winter forage, and we no-tilled the Sorghum Sedan into it, same species, planted within 5 minutes of each other, the same variety, and you can see the huge difference in the growth between the two because of what's called allelopathy. It's compounds given off by winter forages, winter triticale, winter rye, that inhibit the next crop. We were also looking at using sorghum on fields that had been winter killed. We've run into this across the northern part of the United States a lot the last couple of years. You come out in the spring and all your alfalfa is dead. So we had the bright idea of no-tilling oats into it, taking the oats off at flag leaf stage about mid-June, and then no-tilling Sorghum Sedan into it and taking the Sorghum Sedan off. It was a spectacular failure, as you can see in this picture. Where the sorghum is growing, that's where it was bare soil. Where the sorghum is not growing, that's where the oats had been growing. Oat allelopathy completely eliminated the sorghum or Sorghum Sedan. We repeated the study this year. And again, we found where we went right into after harvesting the oats and planted sorghum, the sorghum didn't grow. If we planted sorghum into a fallow situation, it grew fine. And if we took the disc and lightly tilled the top inch or two of soil in the oat field, we were able to grow sorghum with no trouble whatsoever. So that's the piece to keep in mind if you're going from winter forage or oats to a sorghum species. A light disking will break up the allelopathy. It also works nice because we can put the manure down, lightly disc it to capture the nitrogen, and then we go from there and plant our sorghum right into the field. Planting sorghum really is just like planting corn in that the better the quality of the drill, the better the results. Individual seed indexing is best. That's where it picks up each seed individually, very much like the vacuum planters on corn planters, and drops it in the ground. We want it in about an inch deep. A major problem we have with growing sorghum and Sorghum Sedans is the drills. If you look here, this was planted across coming down through. It hit a little rise. It bent the tube on the drill, held all the seed, and then dropped it into a pile. That pile is growing in competition with itself. That's the part of the field that's going to start to lodge real early in the season because it's planted at too high a population. And the culprit is right here. Nearly all the drills have these corrugated tubes. The corrugated tubes, as they bend, they catch the seed, and then they dump it all in one place. There is a sleeved tube now. Each of these sit inside of each other and it slides straight up and down. I don't know, Phil. I have ordered stuff from them. This is where you can buy these tubes and put them on the drill. They're anywhere from $10 to $13 a tube. I did it with an old 1957 drill and it worked phenomenally well, made a huge difference in the uniformity of stand. The good news is that there are newer drills now. This one, I believe, was a Landau. It has rigid tubes in it that slide inside of each other. So there's no catching of the seed. It drops the seed and plants it uniformly. A critical step in growing sorghum and Sorghum Sedans is planting after the soil is 60 degrees and it is forecast to be warming. That is critical. And this usually occurs after first cutting haylage, so it spreads your workload out. This was a study I put in. We planted all the trial, and then 2 weeks later, we came back and we planted the alleyways. Well, what you're looking at here is the alleyways. This was the trial. It completely died for the simple reason is after we planted, we've got a very cold rain and the temperature went from 70 degrees at 4 inches to 40 degrees and it killed out all of the sorghum and the Sorghum Sedans. So you need to look at your weather forecast coming up. It needs to be warm and it needs to stay warm so the crop will grow. The advantage of having it grow fast is it's going to beat things like this, annual grasses. We use concept treated seed. It's also called safe-in seed. Safe-in seed, you can use atrazine and dual, and that will control the weeds and not hurt the sorghum or the Sorghum Sedan. But you do need to be careful. If you go out and plant the seed and then 3 or 4 days later, you call your agribusiness up to come in and spray the field and they put it in the schedule. And then a week after that, they get in and spray, you're gonna have weeds. When you're out there to start planting, you call the sprayer up and get him out there so that they can be spraying as soon as you're finished planting. Otherwise, when you get this showing in your field, you already have a problem. Now there is a new herbicide that has just come out that can control some of these annual grasses. It's mainly used in grain sorghum. They're just starting to bring it into the forage sorghums. It's a very new concept. So that will be coming down the pike, but it is not here now. So you need to make sure that you are using warm conditions and then a quick herbicide treatment to keep the annual grasses out of the field. What helps also is to move away from the corn planting paradigm. The corn planting paradigm is we have to plant in rows. This is Sorghum Sedan planted in 30-inch rows, and the weeds are coming in. Sunlight is hitting the ground. You're losing growth potential because it's not hitting leaf tissue. Here it is again, and you can see there was a lot of weeds coming up in the 30-inch rows. Where it was drilled into a solid stand, we don't have weeds in it. And here's another picture of the solid stand. It's intercepting all the sunlight. It's intercepting the raindrop impact, so the soil is staying porous, and it's shading the ground. And once we get less than 60% incident light, there is no annual grasses will grow underneath that. So we are definitely moving to drilling this in narrow rows to maximize the weed and light interception. And in doing so, we actually get 18% more yield in a narrow row than we do with the wide rows. And because you're taking the same number of seeds and spreading them out in the field, you're going to have better standability and less weeds. So all of this contributes to the basic recommendation, which is to drill your sorghum into narrow rows, sorghum or Sorghum Sedan. Nitrogen, we are working on the nitrogen end of it yet. I will tell you right up front, I do not have a high confidence in the nitrogen rates because of the wide range of conditions we have seen. We have used corn nitrogen rates and they have worked out pretty good. This is a study that I did, and it was a cornfield, then it was a winter forage, and then we came in and we planted sorghum afterwards, but we had broken out some compacted layers. Sorghum roots are phenomenal at exploring the deeper layers, retrieving nitrogen, and has moved by most of the other plants. The roots go down deep, pick up that nitrogen and bring it back up. And here we were getting almost 26 tons to the acre of silage at 50 pounds of nitrogen. Very unusual, but it's also something that can happen with sorghum because of its root system. Excuse me. We were doing work with Cornell University. Hold on a second. Dry throat. We were doing work with Cornell University and about 100 to 150 pounds to the acre is where we were seeing most of our responses. But look at up here. At 200 pounds of nitrogen, one year they were getting 33 tons to the acre. The other year they were getting almost 40 tons to the acre. This is in New York. This is farther north where sorghum doesn't grow as well as it does where you are. Sorghum has huge yield potential, and we are looking at the pieces so that you can get that yield on a regular basis. But nitrogen is critical, and we are in the middle of doing more research on this to determine the optimum nitrogen for our sorghum, because sorghum can produce higher crude protein, which means you can feed your animals for less money. You don't need to buy soybean meal. A critical part, though, with nitrogen, we learned this with winter forage, and the same thing holds true with sorghums and Sorghum Sedans. You need sulfur. Sulfur is critical. If it's a manured field, okay, you have sulfur in the manure. But if you're buying commercial fertilizer, you need sulfur. One study I did with winter triticale, I put 115 pounds of nitrogen down as urea. I got 12% crude protein. I put only 100 pounds down as ammonium sulfate, and I had 17% crude protein. The other thing that people get nervous about, well, if I put nitrogen on my sorghum, am I going to get nitrate accumulation? Yes, you could get nitrate accumulation if you do not have sufficient sulfur. Multiple projects, research projects have shown having enough sulfur knocks out the chances or greatly reduces the chances of nitrate accumulation in sorghum and in a lot of other crops. So make sure you have sulfur. We use a mix of 1/4 ton of ammonium sulfate and 3/4 of a ton of urea with agritane so it doesn't volatilize. Gives us a 38006. If you're in an area very low in sulfur, you may want to go with 1/3 and 2/3 as your ratio. But this is a standard mix that we have moved to for all of our research, so we have enough sulfur for the crop. There are pests that will get into it. This was a field in Western New York, was growing very nicely, and then armyworm moved in and was decimating the field. They came in with a high boy rig and was able to wipe them out and recover the crop, and it did very well. A friend of mine last year had Sorghum Sedan. He took the first harvest off. The second harvest got an armyworm outbreak, and he said, well, I'm just going to let it go. Well, this is what he ended up with when he let it go. There was nothing out there. The armyworms just ate up everything that was there. So armyworm can be a problem. I've only seen this twice in about 15 or 20 years. So it's not a real common problem, but you do need to keep your eyes open for it. Other problems that we have are windstorms. Because we have a smaller stalk, even with the brachytic dwarfs, but because it is a brown midrib gene, which means less lignin, they can go down a lot easier. This was the day before Hurricane Irene. This was the day after Hurricane Irene, and you can see the crop was flattened. But looking 2 weeks after the hurricane, it was all standing back up again. The BMR will reorient itself and bring it back up. Last year, I had an organic farmer in Massachusetts, had 150 acres of Sorghum Sedan. He had a horrific thunderstorm come through, flatten all 150 acres. He called me up because he and his son were discussing whether they should be going out and mowing it right now or not. And the son did not want to mow it because it would have been a mess. I told him, put a board fence around the field so you don't have to look at it for 3 or 4 weeks. They didn't put the board fence around, but they left it for 3 or 4 weeks. And at that time, he called me back up and he says, this is a breeze to chop. It's all standing back up again. So just because it gets knocked down does not mean it's going to stay down. Where these pictures were taking the research farm, we actually had a tornado come right through the middle of our research plots and really flatten the crop. And 3 weeks later, it was all standing back up again. So that's the advantage of the BMR sorghums, Sorghum Sedans. They will recover after lodging in most cases. We have moved away from a multi-cut system. We have gone to a one-cut sorghum or Sorghum Sedan. It's a breeze to chop. The biggest problem I have is the guy in the chopper drives too fast and he leaves longer and longer stubs in the field, which is lost yield. But it is a breeze to direct chop. It's going to give you less time involved in harvest. Harvesting cost is 50% less. There's no dirt mixed in the forage because you're not dropping it on the ground. And as I said, very easy to chop. Seeing this is work that I did in New York, and they did similar work in Wisconsin and found the same results. With a one-cut system, it just keeps on adding yield. With a two-cut system, you go back to zero when you take that harvest, and it takes a long time to recover. And in fact, we get twice as much yield taking a one cut than we do a two cut. And because we're not out in the field with the machinery twice, we just cut our harvesting costs in half. So the cost per ton is 1/4 because we doubled the yield and cut our harvest cost in half. I highly recommend that you go to a one-cut system. Mine with Sedan grass and Sorghum Sedan, both of them found the same results. Higher yield with a one-cut system. Now, the reason people went to multi-cut is they thought that if I cut it at a lower stage, I'll have more milk per ton. Not true. This is some work done in a SARE research project with some people in Delaware County, New York. And as the yields went up, the amount of milk per acre went up. It was nearly a straight line. Yes, it curves just slightly, but you can get the milk up here that we can get down here, and you get more yield by going with a one-cut system. Now, we are changing this equation, and that's the part I want to cover now in my talk. Using a male sterile and delaying harvest, we can increase the yield, but increase the feed quality tremendously. This is a major breakthrough we have made, and we are in the middle of conducting the finalized research on this. But you can improve your feed quality tremendously switching to a male sterile genetic base. Corn silage has energy in the fibers and sugars and mostly in the grain starch. And everybody gets excited about how much grain we have in our corn. In sorghum, if we don't have grain, we have the same energy, but it's in a different source. It's in plant fibers, plant cells, it's in sugars and in starch. You want to see this in action. Is this a theory, or what will the cows tell you? A study done at Minor Institute, Dr. Grant and others at Minor Institute did a study of Sorghum Sedan. It was a multi-cut, and corn silage. They fed either 35 or 45% of the diet, and they would just switch out. They took out corn silage and put in sorghum silage. Looking at the dry matter intakes at 45% feeding rate, the cows ate 51 pounds of corn silage. Dry matter, they ate 38 pounds of Sorghum Sedan silage dry matter. You're going to say right away, wait a minute, the cows aren't eating this stuff. How can they milk? Well, let's look at the results. The body weight change over the 4-week period, the corn silage cows only gained 18 pounds. The Sorghum Sedan cows gained 26 pounds. They were getting more out of the Sorghum Sedan than out of the corn silage. Looking at milk production, they were producing nearly the same fat-corrected milk. And when we dropped the 35% feeding level, they were producing the same fat-corrected milk, but they were doing it on less dry matter intake from the Sorghum Sedan, which means their fat-corrected milk for dry matter intake was much higher with the sorghum species than with the corn silage species. This is a game changer, that we can get as much or more out of a pound of dry matter from sorghum than we can out of corn silage. When we were doing some of the early work on this, we took seeded type sorghum. The standard, it was a Butyric dwarf, and we looked at it over a time frame. Here it was boot stage. This is the metabolizable energy from corn silage. This is the metabolizable energy from sorghum as we went from boot stage all the way up through the early soft dough to mid soft dough stage. The sorghum increased in energy and then ran slightly under corn. So when you're feeding sorghum, you have to feed a little more cornmeal to make up for the energy that is slightly short. When you look at metabolizable protein from corn and the metabolizable protein from sorghum, sorghum had more metabolizable protein than does corn. So we take out soybean meal and we put in a little cornmeal to balance the ration. Soybean meal is a lot more expensive than cornmeal. And so you're ahead economically using a sorghum in the feeding trial. The key thing to understand here is sorghum is not corn silage. If you just pull out corn silage and throw in sorghum, there's a 95% chance those cows are going to crash. I had two 30,000-pound herds, one in Minnesota, one in New York. They both fed sorghum instead of corn. The one in New York, the production went way down. The one in the Minnesota kept on producing because they rebalanced the ration. You need to add a little bit of cornmeal. You need to take out soybean meal, and you need to feed a higher fiber feeding level. The amount of NDF fed needs to be higher because the brown midrib gene fiber in sorghum carries a lot of milk production. In Texas, the standard there is when the seed head turns brown, and it's soft dough halfway down here. Soft dough is when you squish it and it's like cooked oatmeal. That's when they harvest. We do not harvest at that stage because the upper part of this seed head is rock hard, goes right through the cow and out the back end. As you saw on the previous picture, production went down. Let me back up here and show you that again. If you look here, you can see production went down as we went to a harder and harder seed stage. What we do is we wait until the first seed heads at the tip are just like cooked oatmeal, just starting to get like cooked oatmeal. That's when we harvest. Way sooner than what they do in Texas. And based on our research study, we can get the milk out of the feed then. And the whole reason why is right here. This is sorghum seed. This is number 3 steel shot that we use for hunting. They're about the same size and they're about the same digestibility. One of the researchers actually had his grad students take sorghum seeds and cut them in half or in quarters and put them in the cow's rumen, and they still didn't digest. They are rock hard. They go through without digestion. So having seed starch on your forage sorghum, it's not like corn. It is too hard and it's too small to process. If you run this through a processor, you're going to make soup out of the sorghum, and you're still not going to get the digestion out of these very hard seeds. So with that in mind, we moved to a completely different viewpoint, and that is, let's not have any seeds. We'll eliminate the seeds by going with a male sterile. I call it the beef steer sorghum. There's no fertile seed head out here. There's no seeds being formed. This is just one of the plots in my variety trial where we were getting up in New York 23, 24 tons of 35% dry matter material. There is no weight on the seed head, so it's less likely to get knocked down, less likely to lodge. What happens is the plant, as it's photosynthesizing, it's taking carbon dioxide and water and forming carbohydrates. In the seeded type, because there is a nutrient sink now from the fertile seed, all those nutrients get translocated up into the seed head. With the male sterile, it is producing those carbohydrates, but they are not moving. They are staying in the leaf. In the leaf and in the stem are these plant cells, and they are full of sugar and starch, digestible protein, and digestible cell walls. All of this is digestible material in the BMR. So when you put it into the cow's rumen, it's a slow, steady release of nutrients. It has a higher rumen pH. So for milk cows, we have higher components, excuse me, and less acidosis issues. And no processing is needed. Processing is a complete waste of fuel, time, and wear and tear on the processor. No processing is needed at all in these male sterile ones. Looking at this over time, our concept was as once it heads out, which is at boot stage, from there, it's going to keep on increasing sugars and starches, but there's no dry matter yield in plant fibers being produced. It's solely cellular components. And so it is building up dry matter. The total dry matter yield may stay the same at, let's say, 25 tons to the acre, but the moisture level is dropping significantly. The dry matter is increasing. The non-fiber carbohydrates are going up. The non-structural carbohydrates are going up. The non-fiber increased 71% when we waited 6-7 weeks after boot stage. The non-structural carbohydrates increased 185%, waiting 7 weeks after boot stage. When we looked at the water-soluble sugars, and we had to do a special test to make sure the analysis was correct on this, so we weren't double counting any starch, and we had an extra expense to do this, but we did it, and we found as we went from boot stage up through 7 weeks, the sugar increased 500%. It was up to 18.8% dry matter was sugar. Where this comes in critical, I know, for dairy cows, and it would also be for beef cows, excuse me, for dairy cows, increasing the sugar in the rumen increases the protein in the milk without causing acidosis. If you just poured sugar into the rumen, you would get acidosis, screws up the animal, screws up production. But because this sugar is in little plant cells and each cell is slowly broken down and released, that sugar is fully utilized in the rumen and produces energy for the animal. The same way with beef cows. We did a trial with beef cows. We had almost the same, this is before we had this high sugar material. We had almost the same gain over the winter as we did feeding a regular grain and corn silage diet. But we were able to do it using grass-fed as the system. And there are several areas where they are looking seriously at this male sterile. It meets the grass-fed criteria, but puts on a rate of gain much like feedlot-fed animals would be putting on, simply because of this very high sugar component. What happens with the male sterile is the sugar keeps increasing. A seeded type, and we had accidentally had it a seeded type this year, the seeded type will increase sugar, but as soon as that pollinated seed starts demanding nutrients from the rest of the plant, it starts taking the sugar and putting it into starch, and the sugar levels go down. Your starch levels do go up, but the sugar levels go down. The starch levels go up in the seeded type, but keep in mind, this starch is completely wasted. And the reason it is wasted is because it is rock hard little BBs that go right through the cow and out the other end. So we do not want to have that. Yes, it'll show up on the forage analysis. And yes, you go and put it into the ration using that forage analysis, and no, the animals do not produce on it like they could, because most of this digestible starch is going out the back of the cow in very hard seeds. Whereas if we use the sugar type, all of that is available in the male sterile for the animal to use. The NDF goes down on both of them, but it goes down faster with a seeded type than the unseeded type, simply because the seeded type is cannibalizing everything in the plant to move nutrients to the seed, whereas the male sterile is not. It's leaving the digestible components in the cell wall, and the animal is able to make use of them. The digestibility of the fiber drops with the seeded type. The digestibility of the fiber in the male sterile holds because it is not being cannibalized. It continues to keep its high digestion rate as time goes on. All right, we took this data. Dr. Larry Chase at Cornell, who has been a huge help for me on this. He's a professor emeritus in dairy nutrition at Cornell. He took the data and we did the traditional farmer style. We took the data from the sorghum over time frame and compared that to corn silage, except we took out corn silage, we threw in sorghum. Remember, I said not to do that. And what happened? Production went down. Instead of 85 pounds of milk from metabolizable energy, we were getting 70, 78, 77. It went down. We were still getting metabolizable protein because of the higher protein of the sorghum. When we rebalanced the ration, like I said, took out some soybean meal, added a little bit of cornmeal, and made maximum use of the digestibility of the fiber in the sorghum. We had the same milk metabolizable energy as corn silage. We had higher metabolizable protein than corn silage. So the sorghum did just as well, if not better, than corn silage in the diet. Remember, sorghum is not corn silage. Your nutritionist needs to change the ration. I had one farmer that was feeding sorghum for a number of years. And he said, every time I fed it, my cows went up in production. And he said, my nutritionist didn't know how to feed it and didn't want to learn, which was real frustrating for him. Looking at the rations that we were using, we had a base corn silage diet of 20 pounds of corn silage, 15 pounds of alfalfa, 6 pounds of corn grain, and 3.5 pounds of soy plus. We then rebalanced the ration. 6 pounds of corn grain. For the sorghum, we added 1 pound, basically 9/10 of a pound of cornmeal. For the soy plus, we had 3.5 pounds in the corn diet. We only needed 2.4 in the sorghum diet to produce the same milk. So on 100 cows, that was over $5,000 savings a year in soybean meal. And note at the end, we were able to feed more of the sorghum than when we first started because the digestibility of the fiber was holding and the components in the cells were increasing. So more and more of that dry matter was digestible dry matter that the animals could make use of. And the same thing would be happening in a beef herd because there's more and more energy to put on body condition, body fat than if we didn't have that sugar in there. Excuse me. Now, this is preliminary work. We are repeating the study again this year to double check all of our numbers. But at this point, it is looking that male sterile sorghum has a huge potential from Texas all the way up into Canada to be used as a potential replacement for corn silage. The dry matter, it was interesting. The yellow line was 2020, a very dry year. The blue line was 2021, a very wet year. The dry matter accumulation starting out at boot stage here, it accumulated almost the same curve, just a little bit off because of the wetter year. You are going to be dealing with a wetter feed if you take it early. There is no need to take it at boot stage or early heading. It is not better feed, it is wetter feed, and you're going to haul a whole lot of water for poor quality digestion. We are going 6, 7, and 8 weeks afterwards. The dry matter is increasing and the feed quality, as I showed you, increases phenomenally. Now, how are we going to be chopping this? Because even up here, we're looking at 28 or 25% dry matter. There is a couple pieces in here. First of all, If you take a plant and you chop it up into little pieces, every time you chop a cell, you're releasing liquid. And that's why when they chop sorghum or sorghum Sedan real fine, they have liquid running out all over the place simply because they have chopped so many of the cells. The simple answer on that is lengthen your cut. Inch to an inch and a quarter. They chop an inch and a quarter in Texas all the time. The cows eat all of it. We like at least an inch. Some of the choppers will only go up to 3/4 of an inch. So when you look at it on a continuum, where we chopped at a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 inch with 3 millimeters of processing, we had tremendous amount of leachate running out. In a 5-gallon pail where we were compressing samples, we had 4 inches of water on the top, which is a huge amount. When we increased the length of cut to 1.14 inches, or we went and opened the processor all the way up at 3/4 or 1.14 inch, we had no leachate coming out. None of these had leachate, and there's no need for processing. So up here is where you want to put it. And this is what it looks like. We're not talking about a chopper that has dull knives, making 3- and 4-inch length of cuts, gumming it up and beating it to death. We're talking about sharp, properly set knives, cutting an inch, 3/4 of an inch to an inch long, makes an excellent product. And one of the reasons that we add into this, in addition to reducing leachate, is that this is a brown midrib product. It falls apart very fast in the rumen. And unless you have enough effective fiber, it flushes out of the rumen before it can get to be digested. But by having pieces long enough, they stay in there, they get the full extent of digestion, you get the full nutrition out of it before it flushes out of the rumen, and you reduce or eliminate leachate. I had a farmer in Michigan call me earlier this year. He followed my advice on the longer length of cut and no processing. He filled up one bunk with BMR sorghum. He filled up another bunk with corn silage. He was feeding them out, and he went into the corn silage bunk and he took a sample out and he went over to the sorghum bunk. He said it looked just like the corn silage. There was 0 leachate coming out. But when he got his samples back, his corn silage was 35% dry matter. His sorghum silage was 24% dry matter. No leachate, because he did not process and he cut it a longer length of cut. That said, I highly recommend you use an inoculant. To do otherwise is just being stupid. You're saving pennies and throwing away dollars, piles of dollars. This was a study I did with American Farm Products, and I don't sell any inoculant, but I did work with an American Farm Product inoculant, and where we used the inoculant versus the control, we had 2.3 pounds more milk per cow per day because of the increased digestibility. Actually, we didn't increase digestibility, we saved digestibility. We lost it in the control. On 200 cows, that's $25,000 that we were saving because we used an inoculant. In another study, we were looking at butyric, and you heard the previous speaker talking about butyric. Anything more than 0.5 is real problematic. Remember, we started out at 15–16% dry matter, went up to 25–27% dry matter. In the first study we did this, we had just a little bit of butyric showing up here, and by the time we got up to 25% dry matter, there was no butyric showing at all. We did a better, more controlled study where we made sure that applications were very uniform. This is the study I showed you, the change in dry matter. And under over 2 years, 270 samples, starting at 15% dry matter and going up to 27% dry matter, we had 0 butyric. No butyric showed up in any of the 270 samples, simply because we have sugar in this forage for fermentation. You put the right inoculant on, and the right inoculant allows complete fermentation without any chance of butyric forming. So you need to use an inoculant. An example is like if you were seeding a field down, you go out and you put lime on it, you put fertilizer on it, you work it all up, and then you let whatever grows as your hay field. No, you put seed out there so the alfalfa grows that you want. The same way with inoculant, you want proper fermentation, you want to save your nutrients, you want the right lactic and acetic ratios, as a previous speaker was talking about. To do that, you use an inoculant, especially with the high sugars in the male sterile sorghums. So to harvest this, you cut longer cut, so you're not losing the sugars in fermentation and you don't have leachate. Use a homolactic, not a Butyric bacteria, though there is a Chris Hansen second generation Butyric that has looked very good in my trials. We get perfect fermentation at a low dry matter, but that's a lot of water to haul and a lot of hydraulic pressure. So because of that, we'd rather let the crop stand out there, increase dry matter, increase digestible components, so we have more dry matter in every truckload. And then finally, back to what I started with in the beginning, we want a double crop with winter forage. If you're not using winter forage, you are losing hugely. One of the advantages of sorghum, and this was a trial we were putting in, is it grows its own cover crop. If you didn't get a chance to put a cover crop in, sorghum will grow its own cover crop. So as we move further north to areas where it's tougher and tougher to get a cover on, the sorghum will grow its own cover. In a study over in the high elevations of New York State, they took Sorghum Sedan off, no-till triticale right in. You can see the triticale growing underneath here. Look at the pictures on the right. We got a frost. The sorghum died and gave a nice protection for the winter triticale going into the winter, so it doesn't winter kill. It keeps on growing. The sorghum deteriorates over the winter, and in the springtime, we're harvesting a very nice winter forage crop that followed the sorghum. So sorghum or sorghum sedans are planted after winter forage and haylage, so it balances your workload out. It improves the soil structure. It's a fine root system. It's not like corn, and you're planting it in a solid stand, so it's improving the soil health and soil structure. It matches up with winter forage, so we can grow both crops successfully. It's a lower cost per acre. Sorghum is about $20 an acre. Most of the corn varieties, and I'm not going with top of the line stuff either, are $120 an acre. So right out of the get-go, we're $100 an acre ahead using the sorghum species. It wipes out corn rootworm. If you grow sorghum and you grow corn the next year, there is no need to use any rootworm control because the corn rootworms are wiped out by the sorghum. No processing is needed, so you don't need this humongously expensive processor in there. And in fact, it's counterproductive. You're doing damage to the crop. So you either pull it out or open it all the way. I'd rather not even have it in there. As far as deer go, deer love sorghum. They hide it and they come out and eat the neighbor's corn. They leave the sorghum alone because they take a bite out of it when it's small. It has prussic acid that's higher when it's smaller, and they get a tummy ache, and then they decide not to eat it. So they just hide in it and eat your neighbor's corn. And again, as I said, it's drought and heat tolerant. And we are also finding that a non-BMR male sterile is perfect for growing heifers without getting them fat. The non-BMR, now if you're growing beef animals, you want to use a BMR because you're trying to put weight and fat onto them. If you're growing dairy replacement animals, we go with the non-BMR that grows up a huge frame without getting them fat. So there is no perfect crop. management can make or break the profitability. We are continuing to do research on this crop, and we'll have more information in the future. If you go to my website here, you can see the newsletters on this, and there's a bunch of other newsletters if you want to sign up for them. Okay, Amanda, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Tom. We do have a couple of questions for you in the chat. Let me see. The first one is relating to when you were planting following the oats. How long did you wait after disking the oats before planting the sorghum?
Oh, probably 15 minutes. You basically are breaking up the allelopathy by mixing it into the soil. They just came in, made a pass with the disc, and then came and planted the whole field over again. So it was the same day. The important thing is there's a thin layer there, like a herbicide layer that the oats leaves. By breaking that up and bringing up fresh dirt, it eliminates it.
Perfect. Thank you. This one was a little bit more of a comment than a question, but in case you have anything to add or to comment on this, they said it's a little bit more difficult to do the one cut system if you're doing baleage oriented harvest and storage rather than chopping for silage. Do you have any thoughts or comments on if you were using this under a baleage system?
Yes, they're exactly right. It's a lot easier to have somebody just come in and give it a haircut and put it into an ag bag or something like this. The other side of the coin, though, is if you have a baler with processing knives on it. The sorghum, BMR sorghum breaks up very easy, cuts easy. It will take all of Williamson's talk just before mine, use all that same information, but as you're feeding it in, you don't need to wait for it to dry. You would mow it to a width that your baler will pick up. You're gonna have to go slower because you're baling up 3, 4, 5 times more than any hay crop. And so you have to give the baler time to work. If you think you can haul butt across the field, you're going to rip that baler apart. But with processing knives, as it feeds in, it cuts it up into pieces and makes a nice tight bale and then wrapped right away and makes very good silage. But yes, the bottom line is it's a whole lot easier to have somebody come in with a chopper and just give the field a haircut.
Perfect, thank you. I had another question, which I think is very similar to this one, and you may have just answered it, but any comments on green chopping the sorghum for beef cattle as compared to feeding it as a silage? Any major issues when trying to make baleage?
If I understand the question, they're feeding beef animals and they're looking at chopping it versus putting it into a bag, wrapped. Wrapping is a lot harder to do. They may want to consider, because of the wrapping issue, they may want to consider pearl millet. But if you are going to go with the sorghum species, the male sterile is the better way of going because we're jacking the sugar up. So it's the same, especially if you're doing grass-fed beef. We have more and more people doing grass-fed beef. The male sterile will meet the criteria for grass-fed beef. What some guys do is they'll put it into a bag and then they have a feeder in front and they just keep feeding it back as they go. Clean up the manure behind it so that it's dry enough for the animals and just let them keep working their way through the bag, eating it that way.
Great, thank you. And then another question actually pertaining to pearl millet, which you just mentioned. Have you done anything with millets, pearl millet in particular? Have you looked into that at all?
Yes, I have. Pearl millet is excellent for grazing. The BMR pearl millet, it makes an incredibly dense stand, which is all leaves. Caution there, a guy in Indiana had pearl millet. He turned his animals out into it and he lost 3/4 of his animals to bloat. So this is really lush stuff. You better get some dry matter into them. Make sure that you're not going to be setting yourself up for a bloat issue. But otherwise, pearl millet is very good. There is an experimental pearl millet I've used out of the University of Nebraska. I don't know if it's commercially available yet. We planted it the 4th of July, and the 1st of October took off 26 tons to the acre. Just phenomenal yielding stuff. But I don't think that is quite available yet. The other side of the coin is we planted some of that 2 years ago. We were doing it, trying it several years in a row. We planted it the 3rd week in June up in near the Canadian border. It came up out of the ground. It got to be about 4 inches tall. And when we were ready to harvest in October, there was maybe a dozen plants out there. The reason being is pearl millet does not like cold temperatures. Delaware is a whole lot warmer than upstate New York, so you may be fine. But I would be cautious. It doesn't like cold weather at all.
Great, thank you. I think that is all of the questions that we were seeing in the chat, unless anyone has a last minute question. I think we've covered everything.
If they have any questions, my email address is on the screen. They can send them directly to me. And also my website is there where I have a whole bunch of newsletters if they want to read up on more stuff.
Perfect. Thank you very much. With that, I think we'll wrap up and move on to our next presentation. So thank you again, Tom, for being here, for sharing all this information with us. We appreciate you taking the time to join us.
All right, you're welcome. Goodbye.